Welcome back, traveler, to yet another story. Imagine a world where Captain America, the living symbol of freedom and democracy, whispers two words that shatter everything you thought you knew. Hail Hydra. For over 75 years, Steve Rogers stood as Marvel's ultimate symbol of heroism, the man who punched Hitler in the face on his very first cover, who fought the Nazis while his creators, two Jewish men named Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, used him to make a statement against fascism in a world careening toward war. He was the first Avenger, the sentinel of liberty, the man whose moral compass always pointed toward justice. But in 2016, writer Nick Spencer and Marvel Comics did the unthinkable. They revealed that Captain America had been a sleeper agent for Hydra all along. Not a clone, not mind control, not an alternate universe doppelganger. The real Steve Rogers, twisted by forces beyond his control into believing that Hydra's vision was the true path to a better world. This is the story of Secret Empire, one of the most controversial comic book events in modern history. A story about how even our greatest heroes can be corrupted, how fascism can wear the mask of righteousness, and how the very symbols we trust can be weaponized against us. This is the story of what happened when Captain America became a Hydra agent and nearly destroyed the world. The journey toward Secret Empire began not with a bang, but with the quiet manipulation of a child. To understand how Captain America became Hydra Supreme, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to Pleasant Hill, a seemingly idyllic small town with a dark secret hidden beneath its perfectly manicured lawns and friendly smiles. In 2016, during the Avengers standoff crossover event, heroes discovered that S.H.I.E.L.D. director Maria Hill had been operating an illegal prison unlike any the Marvel Universe had seen before. Pleasant Hill wasn't just holding supervillains, it was rewriting them entirely. At the heart of this operation was Kobik, a sentient cosmic cube who had taken the form of a young girl. Cosmic cubes in the Marvel Universe are reality-warping artifacts of immense power, created by the mysterious Beyonders and capable of reshaping existence itself. But Kobik was different from previous cubes. She wasn't a single artifact that had evolved consciousness. She was the fusion of fragments from many different cosmic cubes, each with their own history and connection to various wielders throughout Marvel's history. As a result of this fractured origin, she manifested with the mentality and innocence of a 4-year-old child, desperate to help people and make them happy, but lacking the wisdom to understand the consequences of her actions. S.H.I.E.L.D. had gathered these cosmic cube fragments over years of operations across the globe. One day, in the laboratories of Dr. Karen Fowler, the erratic behavior of these pieces caused them to violently merge together into a single being. The explosion killed Dr. Fowler, and from the wreckage emerged Kobik, confused and frightened. S.H.I.E.L.D., seeing an opportunity too valuable to pass up, placed her under the care of Dr. Eric Selvig, one of the world's leading experts on cosmic cubes. But while Selvig genuinely came to see Kobik as a daughter figure, another force was already manipulating the young cube from the shadows. The Red Skull had a long history with cosmic cubes. In the past, Captain America had shattered one of the Skull's cubes with his mighty shield, scattering it into fragments that would eventually become part of Kobik herself. Because of this connection, Kobik remembered the Skull. She felt an affinity for him, a bond from her previous existence. Upon gaining sentience and desperate to find someone who truly loved her, Kobik reached out through space and time with her power of omnipresence. She found the one being who had cherished her previous incarnation most, the Red Skull. What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. The Red Skull couldn't directly control Kobik or force her to use her powers, but he didn't need to. He understood that she was a child, impressionable and eager to please. So he began teaching her, filling her mind with false histories and twisted ideologies. He read her bedtime stories that portrayed Hydra not as a terrorist organization bent on world domination, but as a noble cause working toward human perfection and order. He showed her a world where Hydra were the heroes and freedom fighters were the real villains standing in the way of paradise. Kobik believed every word. In her innocent mind, she began to see Hydra as the most pure and good thing in the universe. And with that belief firmly planted, the Red Skull set his plan in motion. He used his psychic powers, augmented by having Professor Xavier's brain grafted into his own skull, to implant an idea in Dr. Selvig's mind. The doctor, now secretly loyal to Hydra, though he didn't fully understand why, proposed Project Kobik to director Maria Hill. The concept seemed noble enough on the surface. Use Kobik's reality warping abilities to rehabilitate supervillains, giving them new identities and peaceful lives in the idyllic town of Pleasant Hill. Hill approved the project, believing it to be a humane alternative to the revolving door of supervillain prisons that never seemed to hold their inmates for long. What she didn't know was that this entire operation was designed by the Red Skull to position Kobik exactly where he needed her to be. The villains transformed by Kobik into Pleasant Hill citizens had their memories and even their physical appearances completely rewritten. The Fixer became a simple mechanic. Baron Zemo became an unassuming resident. Dozens of Marvel's most dangerous criminals were turned into ordinary people with fabricated pasts, unaware of who they truly were. But the Red Skull's plan went far beyond simply creating a prison. He was setting the stage for the corruption of Captain America himself. At this time, Steve Rogers was no longer the super soldier the world remembered. In 2014's Captain America series by Rick Remender, Steve had battled a villain known as the Iron Nail, who managed to drain the super soldier serum from Rogers' system. Without the serum that had kept him young and powerful for decades, Steve's body rapidly aged to match his actual chronological age. He became a 90-year-old man, still possessing his tactical genius and indomitable will, but physically unable to continue as Captain America. Sam Wilson, the Falcon, took up the shield and became the new Captain America, while Steve took on an advisory role. But the Red Skull saw an opportunity in Rogers' weakened state. He disguised himself as Father Patrick, a kindly priest living in Pleasant Hill, and waited. When Baron Zemo and the Fixer broke free from their conditioning and led an uprising of the imprisoned villains, chaos erupted across the town. Both the Avengers and the Uncanny Avengers arrived to contain the situation, and in the confusion, Steve Rogers found himself searching for Kobik in her favorite place, the Pleasant Hill bowling alley. As Steve tried to reason with the frightened cosmic cube, Crossbones attacked him brutally, leaving Rogers on the brink of death. This was the moment the Red Skull had been waiting for. Kobik, desperate to save Steve and wanting to help him become the best version of himself, used her powers to restore his youth and heal his injuries. But at that crucial moment, believing that Hydra represented everything good and pure, she made him what she thought was perfect. She rewrote Steve Rogers' entire history. In the reality that Kobik created and implanted into Steve's mind, his life had been completely different from the start. The year was 1926, and a woman named Elisa Sinclair came to the low-income neighborhoods of Brooklyn, New York. Sinclair was no ordinary woman. She was an ancient and powerful sorceress, a high-ranking member of Hydra with connections to dark forces like the elder god Chthon. Some suggested she might even be immortal. She possessed the ability to see the future, to glimpse the threads of destiny, and in young Steve Rogers, she saw something extraordinary. She saw the key to Hydra's ultimate victory. Elisa approached Steve's mother, Sarah Rogers, a textile mill worker trapped in an abusive marriage with Steve's father, Joseph. Sarah was desperate, struggling to protect her frail son while enduring her husband's violence. Elisa offered kindness, support, and a community that seemed to care. She introduced Sarah to a local civic league, a charitable organization that did good works in the neighborhood. What Sarah didn't realize was that this organization was actually a front for Hydra. As Sarah became more involved, Elisa began indoctrinating her in Hydra's philosophies, teaching her that true strength came from collective action and that the weak needed the strong to guide them toward a better future. When Joseph Rogers' abuse continued, despite Sarah's attempts to find safety, Elisa made a decision. She ordered her men to kill Joseph Rogers, making it look like an accident. This act terrified Sarah. She finally understood the true nature of the organization she had joined and tried to flee with young Steve. But Elisa intercepted them. In the confrontation that followed, Sarah Rogers was killed and Steve was abducted by Hydra agents. The young boy was taken across the Atlantic to the Keep, a Hydra training facility hidden in the English countryside. Despite his poor physical condition and sickly constitution, Elisa vouched for Steve, insisting that her visions confirmed he was the chosen one who would lead Hydra to greatness. Steve was placed under the instruction of Dr. Sebastian Fenhoff, also known as Dr. Faustus, and Daniel Whitehall, the Kraken. These men were masters of psychological manipulation and ideological conditioning. At first, Steve resisted. Even as a child, he possessed an innate sense of right and wrong, a stubborn refusal to bend to tyranny. He challenged his instructors, questioned Hydra's methods, and clung to his mother's memory. But Daniel Whitehall was patient and cunning. He didn't try to break Steve's spirit. Instead, he reframed everything through a lens that would appeal to the boy's core values. Whitehall taught Steve that Hydra wasn't about oppression or cruelty. It was about collective strength, about protecting humanity from itself. He showed Steve how democracy was failing, how the weak were exploited by those who claimed to champion freedom. He convinced Steve that true justice required order, discipline, and the guidance of those strong enough to make hard decisions for the greater good. Slowly, over months and years, Steve began to believe. It helped that at the Keep he found a friend in Helmut Zemo, the son of Baron Heinrich Zemo. The two boys trained together, studied together, and formed a bond that would last for decades. Steve's instructors noticed his exceptional intelligence, his dedication to mastering both academic subjects and combat training, despite his physical limitations. They began to see what Elisa Sinclair had predicted. This frail boy possessed an unbreakable will and a brilliant tactical mind. He was indeed destined for greatness. As the 1930s progressed and Europe marched toward another world war, Hydra's leadership gathered at the Keep to make a crucial decision. Baron Heinrich Zemo wanted Hydra to ally with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, seeing an opportunity to ride the wave of fascism sweeping across Europe. But Elisa Sinclair vehemently opposed this plan. She warned that Hitler was nothing more than a power-hungry madman, that his ideology of racial supremacy was a poison that would consume Hydra's true purpose. She insisted that Steve Rogers was the key to Hydra's destiny, not Hitler. Despite her protests, she was outvoted by the Hydra Council. The alliance with the Nazis proceeded, and by 1940, Hydra was deeply embedded in the Third Reich's operations. Steve Rogers, now a young man, was given his first critical mission: infiltrate the Allies and assassinate Dr. Abraham Erskine, the scientist developing the super soldier serum. Steve tracked Erskine down and had him in his sights, but at the last moment, something held him back. The weight of taking a human life, even for Hydra's cause, gave him pause. Before he could overcome his hesitation, Helmut Zemo completed the mission, killing Erskine himself. But the assassination came too late. Dr. Erskine had already shared his formula with the Allies, and Arnim Zola, a Hydra scientist working undercover in the Allied program, took over Project Rebirth. Steve Rogers was selected as the perfect test subject. His entire background had been carefully fabricated by Hydra, making him appear to be a loyal American desperate to serve his country despite his physical limitations. On the day of the procedure, Steve lay in the chamber as the super soldier serum and Vita rays transformed his body. The frail boy became a perfect human specimen, strong and fast and resilient beyond normal human limits. Captain America was born. But he wasn't the hero history would remember. He was a Hydra double agent, secretly supplying intelligence to the enemy while publicly fighting alongside the Allies. Steve played his role perfectly, becoming a symbol of hope and freedom while working to undermine the Allied war effort from within. He befriended Bucky Barnes, who became his partner, never suspecting the truth. He fought the Red Skull in public battles while secretly reporting to other Hydra leaders. He was a spy in the most literal sense, and his deception was flawless. But Steve's allegiance was tested when the Red Skull, drunk with power and Nazi ideology, demanded Steve's absolute loyalty to him personally. Steve balked at this. His loyalty was to Hydra's original vision, the ancient organization that Elisa Sinclair represented, not to the Nazi corruption that the Red Skull embodied. He began to plan his exit from the war, disgusted by what Hydra had become under Nazi influence. Then, Elisa Sinclair found him again in 1944, bringing grave news. The Allies had discovered or created a cosmic cube, a weapon that could rewrite reality itself. They planned to use it to ensure their victory in the war. Steve realized the implications immediately. If the Allies used the cube, they could alter history so that the Axis powers never rose to power, or change reality so completely that Hydra's influence would be erased. This was the true threat to everything Hydra had worked for. By 1945, Steve was in Ashomia, Japan, meeting with the Kraken, Isaac Newton, the founder of Hydra's original incarnation as the Brotherhood of the Spear, and even Nostradamus, whose mystical visions confirmed what Elisa had foreseen. The cosmic cube would be used, and reality would be rewritten. Hydra's history, of glory, their victory over the weak and corrupt democracies, all of it would be transformed into a lie. A false reality would be created where the Allies won the war, where Hydra became nothing more than a terrorist organization, where Steve Rogers fought for freedom instead of order. And that's exactly what happened. The cosmic cube was activated, and reality itself was rewritten. In the new timeline, Hydra never won World War II. The Nazis were defeated. Steve Rogers fought genuinely for the Allies, not as a spy, but as a true hero. He was frozen in ice and awakened decades later to join the Avengers, becoming the man the world knew and loved. But in Steve's mind, in the memories that Kobik had implanted, he remembered the truth. He remembered the real history. He knew that the world he was living in was a lie, created by the Allies' cosmic cube to rob Hydra of its rightful victory. This was the Steve Rogers who emerged from Pleasant Hill with his youth restored. To everyone else, Kobik had simply healed him and returned him to his physical prime. But inside, Steve Rogers was a Hydra loyalist who believed he was living in a false reality that needed to be corrected. He had been given a second chance to set history right, and he had the patience, the strategic brilliance, and the trust of the entire superhero community to make it happen. In the months following Avengers standoff, Steve Rogers began laying the groundwork for what would become Secret Empire. He worked slowly and carefully, playing the role of the heroic Captain America while secretly maneuvering pieces into place. His first major move came during the events of Civil War II, when the superhero community was divided over the use of an Inhuman named Ulysses Kane, who could see visions of potential futures. The conflict between Iron Man and Captain Marvel over whether to act on these visions tore the Avengers apart, creating fractures in the superhero community that Steve could exploit. During this time, Steve was secretly working with Baron Helmut Zemo, his childhood friend from the Keep. Zemo had been searching for the scattered fragments of Kobik after her physical form was destroyed during the Pleasant Hill incident. When the villains captured Kobik and tried to strip away her sentience to use her as a regular cosmic cube, Eric Selvig, who genuinely loved Kobik as a daughter, chose to shatter her again rather than let her be enslaved. He then killed himself to keep the location of the fragments secret. But before he died, he scattered Kobik's pieces across the globe, hiding them in places only he knew. Steve Rogers needed those fragments. They were the key to his ultimate plan, to reassemble the cosmic cube and use its power to rewrite reality once more, this time restoring the true timeline where Hydra had won World War II. But to gather the fragments, he first needed to position himself in a place of ultimate authority. He needed to become the most trusted person in the world. His opportunity came through S.H.I.E.L.D. itself. Steve manipulated events to have Maria Hill removed as director and engineered his own appointment to the position. As director of S.H.I.E.L.D., he had access to resources, intelligence networks, and military assets beyond anything he'd possessed before. He could track the cosmic cube fragments. He could position Hydra agents throughout the government. He could prepare for a takeover that would happen so quickly and completely that resistance would be impossible. But Steve wasn't content to simply lead S.H.I.E.L.D. He needed to unify Hydra under his command, and that meant dealing with the Red Skull. The clone of the original Nazi war criminal had re-established himself as Hydra's leader after Pleasant Hill, believing that Steve Rogers was now loyal to him because of Kobik's alterations. But the Red Skull was wrong. Steve's loyalty was to the true Hydra, the ancient organization that existed long before the Nazis corrupted it. To Steve, the Red Skull represented everything that had gone wrong with Hydra, the racial hatred and mindless violence that had tainted the organization's noble mission. In Captain America, Steve Rogers, issue 15, Steve confronted the Red Skull in a battle for Hydra's soul. The issue was filled with flashbacks showing Hydra's true history, separate from Nazi ideology, framing it as an ancient brotherhood dedicated to human advancement through strength and unity. The Red Skull, wrapped in Nazi symbolism and racist ideology, stood as the false leader. Steve Rogers, representing Hydra's original vision, stood as the true heir. In the end, Steve killed the Red Skull in cold blood, stabbing him and claiming leadership of Hydra for himself. He became Hydra Supreme. With the Red Skull gone, Steve needed to rebuild Hydra's leadership. Enter Elisa Sinclair, who somehow manifested in the present day, despite having existed in the alternate timeline created by Kobik. She took up the mantle of Madame Hydra and began assembling a new High Council. She recruited the Hive, an ancient parasite composed of individual organisms that formed a humanoid shape. She brought in Gorgon, a mutant extremist who led the Hand organization. She enlisted Viper, a former Madame Hydra who had strayed from Hydra's path but was offered a chance to reclaim her position. Dr. Faustus, the master of psychological manipulation, joined the council. So did Arnim Zola, the bioengineer who had first given Steve his super soldier abilities. Baron Zemo, Steve's oldest friend, completed the council. But Steve's plans extended beyond just rebuilding Hydra's leadership. He understood that to truly succeed, he would need to recruit heroes, to turn some of Marvel's greatest champions to his cause. And he was remarkably successful. The Punisher was the first. Frank Castle had always idolized Captain America, seeing him as the one truly pure hero in a corrupt world. When Steve approached Frank and told him about Hydra's true mission, about their plan to bring order to chaos and protect humanity from itself, Frank listened. Steve offered him resources for his war on crime, state-of-the-art weapons, and intelligence networks. Most temptingly, Steve revealed that once they assembled the cosmic cube, they could rewrite reality itself. Frank could save his family, undo the tragedy that had created the Punisher in the first place. It was an offer Frank couldn't refuse, even though doubt gnawed at him. Deadpool was easier to manipulate. Wade Wilson had developed an almost childlike loyalty to Captain America after joining the Avengers Unity Division. When S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Phil Coulson began investigating Steve's suspicious activities, Steve ordered Deadpool to kill him. Wade didn't question the order. He trusted Cap completely and murdered Coulson without hesitation. This act bound Deadpool to Hydra's cause, and he became a member of Hydra's version of the Avengers, though guilt over his actions would eventually lead him to sabotage Hydra from within. The Odinson, Thor stripped of his worthiness and unable to wield Mjolnir, was recruited with promises that Steve couldn't necessarily keep. Captain America told the Odinson that Hydra could cure Jane Foster's cancer and restore the connection between Midgard and Asgard. The Odinson, desperate to save Jane and feeling lost without his power, agreed to fight for Hydra. He would later become disillusioned with Hydra's fascistic methods and defect back to the side of good during the final battle. Vision was taken through more direct means. Arnim Zola created an AI virus that infected the android Avenger, forcing him to join Hydra's Avengers against his will. Throughout Secret Empire, Vision would occasionally fight back against the virus, his consciousness struggling to break free. The Scarlet Witch, meanwhile, became possessed by the demon Chthon, who had tormented her many times before. Under the demon's influence, she too joined Hydra's team. Even Black Ant and Taskmaster, who discovered evidence of Steve's Hydra allegiance, were recruited by Elisa Sinclair with a combination of threats and promises of power. By early 2017, everything was in place. Steve Rogers commanded S.H.I.E.L.D. He led Hydra as its supreme commander. He had a council of supervillains and corrupted heroes at his command. And he was ready to make his move. The event that would become Secret Empire began with a coordinated three-pronged crisis designed to scatter Earth's heroes and leave them vulnerable. First, the Chitauri, an alien race that had attacked Earth before, returned in massive numbers. Trillions of the insectoid warriors approached Earth in ships that blotted out the stars. This was no coincidence. Steve had orchestrated the invasion, using his S.H.I.E.L.D. resources to provoke the Chitauri into attacking. He knew that Earth's cosmic-level heroes, including Captain Marvel, Alpha Flight, Quasar, and Hyperion, would move to defend against this threat. They took up positions around Earth's planetary defense shield, a massive energy barrier designed to protect the planet from extraterrestrial invasions. Second, a group called the Army of Evil, composed of supervillains who had escaped from Pleasant Hill, launched a massive attack on Manhattan. Nitro, whose explosive powers had once caused a disaster in Stamford that kicked off the First Civil War, detonated himself in the heart of the city. The explosion was devastating, but it was followed by something worse. Baron Zemo, working with Steve's plan, used the Darkhold, an ancient tome of dark magic, to amplify Blackout's powers. Blackout, whose abilities allowed him to tap into the Darkforce dimension, engulfed half of Manhattan in an impenetrable dome of living darkness. Every hero in Manhattan who had responded to the Army of Evil's attack, including the Defenders and numerous street-level heroes, was trapped inside a dimension of nightmares where Baron Mordo's demons hunted them relentlessly. Dagger, whose light powers made her a beacon of hope in the darkness, could only provide a few hours of illumination each day before exhausting herself. Third, S.H.I.E.L.D. detected a crisis in Sokovia, dispatching 6 helicarriers to investigate. What appeared to be a legitimate emergency was actually a trap. The helicarrier Crescent had been secretly taken over by Hydra forces, and Dr. Faustus, the master psychologist, had the entire crew under his mind control. As S.H.I.E.L.D. director, Steve Rogers was aboard the Iliad, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s flagship helicarrier. As they approached Sokovia, the Crescent suddenly appeared and rammed directly into the Iliad. Hydra agents swarmed aboard the Iliad, and Steve Rogers revealed his true allegiance to Sharon Carter, his longtime love and one of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s most trusted agents. The look of betrayal and horror on her face was everything Steve had expected. Dr. Faustus broadcast his mind control signal across all 6 helicarriers, turning the crews into Hydra loyalists in an instant. Steve then revealed the full scope of his plan. The planetary defense shield had been malfunctioning, damaged by what appeared to be a Hydra attack on its generator base. In reality, Steve had sabotaged the shield himself, creating superficial damage to cover his tracks. Now, with Earth's cosmic heroes outside the shield fighting the Chitauri, Steve activated the barrier at full power, trapping Captain Marvel, Alpha Flight, and all of Earth's space-based defenders on the wrong side. They were locked out of Earth's atmosphere, unable to return to protect the planet. Within minutes of Steve's betrayal, America was under attack from within. The captured SHIELD helicarriers moved into position over Washington, D.C., a show of overwhelming force that paralyzed the government. With Manhattan trapped in darkness, with Earth's most powerful heroes locked out by the SHIELD, and with SHIELD itself now serving Hydra, resistance seemed impossible. But Steve had one more card to play. One more act that would cement Hydra's control and terrify anyone who might think of fighting back. Las Vegas had become a base for the underground resistance, a group of heroes who operated in secret, trying to oppose Hydra's growing influence. Led by Hawkeye, the underground included Ant-Man, Black Widow, Hercules, Quicksilver, and others. They had been rescuing people from Hydra's grasp, including a young hacker named Ray Sean Lucas, who carried data from Rick Jones, proving the truth about Captain America's transformation. When the underground's presence in Las Vegas became too visible, the High Council of Hydra demanded action. Steve Rogers didn't personally order what happened next. He had given Madame Hydra, Elisa Sinclair, the authority to make decisions when necessary. And Elisa, ruthless and pragmatic, decided that Las Vegas would serve as an example. Hydra helicarriers appeared over the city and opened fire with everything they had. The bombardment was relentless and total. Buildings collapsed, fires spread. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the attack. By the time the bombardment ended, Las Vegas was a smoking crater, virtually erased from the map. It was Hydra's message to anyone who would resist. This is the price of defiance. The attack on Las Vegas shattered the resistance emotionally. Black Widow, in particular, was devastated. She believed in fighting for what was right, but the cost had become too high. When Rick Jones, who had been captured by Hydra, refused to swear allegiance and say, "Hail Hydra," Steve Rogers had him executed by firing squad. Jones had been a hero, a partner to many of the Avengers over the years, and his death weighed heavily on everyone who knew him. But before he died, Jones had managed to send out a posthumous video message explaining the truth about Steve Rogers, about Kobik, about how the sentient cosmic cube had rewritten Steve's history. The message revealed that Eric Selvig had scattered Kobik's fragments across the world before dying, and that if the fragments could be reassembled, they might be able to restore the true Steve Rogers. This revelation split the resistance into two factions. Tony Stark, existing as an AI consciousness after his physical body had been left in a coma following Civil War II, believed they should search for the cosmic cube fragments and try to fix Steve Rogers. Hawkeye agreed, assembling a team that included Mockingbird, Ant-Man, Hercules, and Quicksilver to hunt for the scattered pieces. But Black Widow disagreed. She thought the idea of fixing Captain America with the same cosmic cube that had corrupted him was foolish. In her mind, Steve Rogers had to die. He was too dangerous to leave alive, and the only way to stop Hydra's regime was assassination. Natasha Romanoff split from the underground and formed her own Red Room, training the younger heroes of the Champions to help her kill Captain America. The Champions included Miles Morales, the Spider-Man, who had additional motivation. During Civil War II, the inhuman Ulysses had experienced a vision of Miles standing over Captain America's corpse. Miles didn't know why he would kill Cap, but the vision haunted him. Black Widow saw an opportunity. She would train these young heroes in the brutal methods of the Red Room, teaching them that sometimes heroes had to make hard choices, that killing wasn't always wrong when the stakes were high enough. Meanwhile, the world adjusted to life under Hydra's rule. The government had fallen in line quickly. with politicians either genuinely supporting Hydra's vision of order or too terrified to resist. Hydra didn't rely solely on fear, though. They used Dr. Faustus's mind-altering substances in water supplies to increase docility and receptiveness among the population. People accepted Hydra's rule more easily than they should have, their critical thinking dulled by chemicals they didn't know they were ingesting. Inhumans, whose powers manifested unpredictably in individuals across the globe, were required to register immediately upon their transformation. Those who refused were arrested and sent to detention facilities. A young Inhuman named Brian McAllister was outed by a bully and immediately picked up by Hydra agents, separated from his family and imprisoned simply for having powers. For mutants, Hydra created a sovereign nation called New Tian in Western California. This appeared to be a sanctuary, a place where mutants could live freely without persecution. But it was also a way to segregate mutants, to keep them in one place where they could be monitored and controlled. The Underground continued their work despite the tragedy of Las Vegas. They established a new base in the Mount, a facility in Nevada, and continued their globe-trotting search for cosmic cube fragments. Their quest took them to the Savage Land, to underwater Atlantean temples, to the territories controlled by Ultron, who had merged with Hank Pym into a strange hybrid consciousness. Each fragment they found was a small victory, but Hydra was searching too, and the race to complete the cosmic cube became the central conflict of Secret Empire. During one of these searches, both the Underground and Hydra's Avengers arrived at Ultron's territory in Alaska, each seeking a fragment in Pym's possession. Ultron captured both groups and tried to get them to reconcile, appealing to the humanity within both sides. He eventually gave the Underground the fragment, touched by Ant-Man's plea to the Hank Pym consciousness within him. But Hydra managed to even the score when Namor, the Submariner and ruler of Atlantis, surrendered his fragment to Steve Rogers in exchange for the safety of his people and his kingdom. As weeks passed, the situation became more desperate. The Mount was infiltrated by Hydra forces who had been tracking the Underground's movements. The resistance fighters barely escaped with their lives, and their safe haven was destroyed. They, scattered across the country, forced to operate in even smaller cells to avoid detection. The pressure was mounting on every front. Inside Manhattan's Darkforce dome, heroes were exhausted from weeks of fighting Mordo's demons with limited rest and dwindling supplies. Dagger pushed herself to the breaking point, trying to provide light for survivors huddled in makeshift shelters. Outside Earth's atmosphere, Captain Marvel and her team continued their battle against the endless waves of Chitauri, unable to break through the planetary defense shield to help their friends below. Black Widow's assassination plan was proceeding. She had trained the champions extensively, teaching them infiltration techniques, combat strategies, and the mental discipline required to take a life. Miles Morales struggled with what was being asked of him. He was just a teenager, a kid from Brooklyn who wanted to be a hero like Peter Parker. The idea of killing anyone, even Hydra Steve, went against everything he believed about what it meant to be Spider-Man. But Natasha was convincing. She showed him footage of Las Vegas, of the detention centers, of families torn apart by Hydra's policies. She reminded him of the vision where he stood over Captain America's body, suggesting that perhaps fate had chosen him for this dark task because he had the moral strength to bear the burden. The assassination attempt came during a Hydra rally in Washington, D.C. Steve Rogers stood before a massive crowd, thousands of citizens who had either genuinely embraced Hydra's ideology or were too afraid to stay home. He spoke about order, about security, about the paradise that Hydra would build once the last remnants of chaos were eliminated. Black Widow and the champions infiltrated the area, moving through the crowds and security checkpoints with practiced ease. Miles positioned himself on a nearby rooftop, his heart pounding as he prepared to do something he'd never imagined. Natasha gave the signal. Miles webbed forward, swinging toward the stage with incredible speed. His Venom Strike, a bioelectric shock that could paralyze opponents, was charged and ready. He would hit Steve Rogers with enough voltage to stop his heart instantly. But as Miles reached the stage, something went wrong. Steve moved at the last possible second, his super soldier reflexes allowing him to dodge the attack that should have been unavoidable. The assassination had been compromised. In the chaos that followed, Black Widow fought desperately to cover the champion's escape. She faced off against Steve Rogers himself, the two former allies trading blows with lethal precision. Natasha Romanoff was one of the world's greatest spies and assassins, trained since childhood in the Red Room's brutal program. But Steve Rogers was a super soldier with decades of combat experience and tactical genius that few could match. The fight was never going to end in her favor, and Natasha knew it. She had accepted her death the moment. She decided Steve needed to die. What she hadn't accepted was dying for nothing. As Steve's shield struck her down, as her body fell and her blood pooled on the ground, Natasha's last thoughts were of failure. She hadn't saved anyone. She hadn't stopped Hydra. She had only gotten herself killed and traumatized the young heroes she'd tried to train. Miles Morales fled the scene with the other champions, guilt and horror overwhelming him. He had failed to save Black Widow. He had failed to stop Captain America. The vision from Ulysses, the one that showed him standing over Steve's body, hadn't come true. Or perhaps it was yet to come. The uncertainty ate at him, and the champions found themselves hunted by Hydra forces, branded as terrorists and murderers for their assassination attempt. They went underground, joining what remained of the resistance as it scattered across the country. The loss of Black Widow devastated the resistance. She had been a symbol of defiance, proof that even in the darkest times, heroes could still fight back. Her death sent a message that Hydra was willing to kill anyone, even beloved heroes, to maintain control. But it also galvanized some who had been sitting on the sidelines. Dr. Strange, who had been dealing with his own crisis involving the depletion of magical energy across multiple dimensions, returned to Earth and joined the resistance. He brought with him Wong and other mystical heroes who could help fight Hydra's magical assets, like the Darkhold. The underground search for cosmic cube fragments continued with renewed urgency. They tracked one fragment to the island nation of Madripoor, a haven for criminals and spies. Another was located in Wakanda, where Black Panther had been allowing refugees to enter his kingdom, despite Hydra's demands that he return them. T'Challa had maintained Wakanda's sovereignty throughout Hydra's rise, using his nation's advanced technology and strong borders to resist Steve's attempts at intimidation. But when the underground came seeking the fragment, T'Challa was forced to make a choice between his people's safety and the chance to defeat Hydra. He chose to help the resistance, providing them with the fragment and opening Wakanda's borders to heroes who needed sanctuary. Meanwhile, Steve Rogers was assembling his own collection of cosmic cube fragments. Hydra's resources were vast, and with S.H.I.E.L.D.'s intelligence networks at his disposal, Steve could track the fragments almost as effectively as the underground. Each side raced to gather the pieces, knowing that whoever assembled the complete cube first would have the power to reshape reality itself. Steve's goal was clear. He would use the cube to restore the timeline where Hydra had won World War II, erasing the false history that the Allies had created and bringing about the world that should have existed all along. But Steve faced challenges from within his own organization. Madame Hydra, Eliza Sinclair, had her own agenda. She was manipulating events behind Steve's back, positioning herself to seize control of the cosmic cube when it was finally assembled. Elisa had been the one to create Hydra Steve in the first place, and she saw him as her tool, not her equal. She believed that she alone had the vision and the will to use the cube properly, to create a world where Hydra's ancient glory would be restored under her guidance. Steve suspected her betrayal, but couldn't move against her openly without fracturing Hydra's High Council at a critical moment. The Punisher was also having doubts, Frank Castle had joined Hydra because Steve Rogers had promised him a world of order, a world where his family could be brought back through the cube's power. But as Frank watched Hydra's methods, the detention centers and public executions and brutal suppressions of dissent, he began to question whether this was really the path to a better world. When he confronted Steve about the growing body count, about the innocent people suffering under Hydra's rule, Steve gave him the same justification that authoritarians have always used: short-term suffering for long-term stability. Frank wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that Captain America knew what he was doing. But doubt had taken root. Weeks into Hydra's occupation, the situation inside Manhattan's Darkforce dome reached a breaking point. Baron Mordo's demons had killed many of the heroes trapped inside, and survivors were running out of food and supplies. Dr. Strange, working from outside the dome with other magical practitioners, attempted to breach the barrier and free those inside. The ritual required immense power and perfect timing. If it failed, the backlash could kill everyone involved. Strange gathered every magic user he could find, including the Scarlet Witch, who had temporarily broken free from Chthon's possession and wanted to make amends for serving Hydra. The ritual began at midnight on the summer solstice, when the boundaries between dimensions were weakest. Dr. Strange and his circle poured everything they had into breaking Blackout's connection to the Darkforce dimension. Inside the dome, Dagger amplified her light powers beyond anything she'd done before, creating a beacon that the outside ritual could lock onto. The combined effort succeeded. The dome shattered like black glass, and Manhattan was suddenly bathed in sunlight for the first time in months. The heroes trapped inside stumbled out, exhausted and traumatized but alive. Cloak absorbed Blackout's essence, neutralizing his powers permanently. The liberation of Manhattan was a major victory for the Resistance, but it came at a cost. The Scarlet Witch, having expended her power to help break the dome, was once again vulnerable to Chthon's influence. The demon reasserted control, and Wanda was dragged back into Hydra's service. Additionally, Hydra responded to the loss of Manhattan by cracking down even harder on other resistance cells. Detention centers filled with anyone suspected of helping the underground. Public executions became more frequent. Steve Rogers went on television and delivered a speech about traitors and terrorists, painting the heroes who had freed Manhattan as dangerous extremists who would rather see the world burn than accept Hydra's peace. But Steve's control was slipping in ways he hadn't anticipated. The cosmic cube fragments were proving harder to contain than he'd expected. Each piece retained some of Kobik's consciousness, and the fragments were beginning to communicate with each other, trying to reunite. Arnim Zola, tasked with keeping the fragments that Hydra had collected in a secure facility, reported strange phenomena. The fragments would move on their own, trying to escape containment. They whispered in voices that sounded like a little girl calling for help. Zola, lacking any emotional attachment to Kobik, simply increased security and continued his work. But the fragment's behavior suggested that Kobik herself was still fighting, still trying to undo what she had done to Steve Rogers. The Underground made a crucial discovery when they found a fragment in the possession of Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier. Bucky had been searching for answers about what happened to Steve, unable to accept that his oldest friend had genuinely become a Hydra agent. When he learned about Kobik and the reality rewrite, Bucky dedicated himself to finding a way to fix Steve. The fragment he possessed was special. It contained more of Kobik's core consciousness than the others, and it showed Bucky glimpses of the truth. The real Steve Rogers still existed somewhere, trapped in a prison of false memories. Kobik's consciousness, fragmented as it was, existed in a kind of mindscape, a pocket dimension created from her own psyche. Inside this dimension, she had recreated Pleasant Hill as she remembered it, but this version was wrong, twisted by her guilt and confusion. And wandering through this false Pleasant Hill was the real Steve Rogers, the version of Captain America who had never been corrupted by Hydra's lies. This Steve had no memory of how he got there, or why the town seemed so empty and lifeless. He only knew that something was terribly wrong, that he was trapped in a place that wasn't quite real. Bucky realized that if they could fully reassemble Kobik and reach her consciousness, they might be able to free the real Steve Rogers and undo the damage she'd done. This revelation split the underground once more. Some, like Hawkeye and Mockingbird, believed this was their best chance to defeat Hydra without more bloodshed. If they could restore the real Captain America, he would become a rallying point for resistance, proof that Hydra's greatest symbol was a lie. Others, particularly those who had lost friends and family to Hydra's regime, argued that it was too risky. What if assembling the cube just made Steve more powerful? What if Kobik couldn't or wouldn't fix her mistake? The debate became moot when Hydra launched a coordinated strike against the underground's scattered cells. Steve Rogers, having finally identified most of the Resistance's hiding places through a combination of surveillance and interrogations, ordered simultaneous raids across the country. In a single night, dozens of heroes were captured. Ant-Man was taken prisoner. Hercules was badly wounded and barely escaped. Quicksilver was caught trying to evacuate civilians from a detention center. The raids decimated the Resistance's numbers and morale, leaving only a small core group still operational. Those who remained free gathered in Wakanda, where T'Challa had opened his borders to any hero who needed sanctuary. The Wakandan king had been preparing for this moment, stockpiling weapons and reinforcing his nation's defenses. He knew that eventually Hydra would come for Wakanda, demanding that he surrender the heroes sheltering there and submit to their authority. T'Challa had no intention of complying. Wakanda had never bowed to outside powers, and he would not let his nation be the first to surrender its sovereignty to fascists wearing the face of Captain America. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Steve Rogers appeared at Wakanda's borders with a massive Hydra army, including helicarriers, enhanced soldiers, and several members of his corrupted Avengers team. He demanded that T'Challa hand over the fugitive heroes and the cosmic cube fragments in Wakanda's possession. T'Challa refused, and the two men, both super soldiers and tactical geniuses, faced off in a battle that would determine the fate of the Resistance. The Battle of Wakanda was brutal and desperate. Wakandan warriors, equipped with vibranium weapons and advanced technology, fought against Hydra's superior numbers. The remaining free heroes, including those who had escaped the raids and those who had been in Wakanda already, joined the fight. Dr. Strange and his magic users battled the Scarlet Witch, trying to free her from Chthon's control. Hawkeye led guerrilla strikes against Hydra's supply lines. Black Panther fought Captain America directly, vibranium claws against vibranium shield, in a duel that showcased both men's combat mastery. During the battle, Bucky Barnes made his move. While everyone was focused on the larger conflict, he used the fragment of Kobik he possessed to enter her mindscape. He found himself in the twisted version of Pleasant Hill, walking through empty streets where nothing quite made sense. Buildings would shift position when he wasn't looking. The sky was the wrong color. And somewhere in this surreal landscape was the real Steve Rogers, the man who had been his best friend for over 70 years. Bucky found Steve sitting alone in the Pleasant Hill bowling alley, the place where Kobik had transformed him. This Steve didn't recognize Bucky at first, confused about where he was and why everything felt like a dream. But as Bucky talked to him, reminded him of their shared history, of fighting in World War II and joining the Avengers, Steve began to remember. The memories were hazy, like trying to recall a dream after waking, but they were real. This was the true Captain America, untouched by Kobik's alterations, preserved in her subconscious mind, because even in her corrupted state, she couldn't completely destroy who Steve Rogers really was. But freeing Steve from the mindscape required something that Bucky didn't have: the complete cosmic cube. Kobik's consciousness was too fragmented to restore Steve to the physical world. They needed all the pieces brought together, and those pieces were scattered between Hydra and the Resistance, each side jealously guarding their fragments. Bucky realized what had to be done. Someone would have to take the Resistance's fragments directly into Hydra's stronghold, where Steve Rogers kept his collection. Someone would have to assemble the cosmic cube in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by Hydra's forces, and hope that Kobik would choose to restore the real Captain America rather than empowering the Hydra version further. That someone was going to be Bucky Barnes. He couldn't ask anyone else to take this risk, to potentially hand Hydra the ultimate weapon. This was his responsibility as Steve's oldest friend, as the man who knew Steve Rogers better than almost anyone alive. If anyone could convince Kobik to do the right thing, it was Bucky. And if he failed, if assembling the cube only made Hydra stronger, then Bucky would die, knowing he'd tried everything possible to save his friend. As the Battle of Wakanda raged, Bucky slipped away from the battlefield with the fragments the Resistance had collected. He infiltrated Hydra's mobile command center, a massive flying fortress where Steve Rogers coordinated the assault on Wakanda. The infiltration was incredibly dangerous, requiring Bucky to use every skill he'd learned as the Winter Soldier. He moved through corridors filled with Hydra soldiers, staying in the shadows, taking out guards silently when necessary. His target was the vault where Arnim Zola kept Hydra's cosmic cube fragments under heavy security. Bucky reached the vault and found it protected by a biometric lock keyed to Steve Rogers' DNA. But Bucky had prepared for this. During the Battle of Wakanda, he'd managed to take a blood sample from Steve when their paths crossed briefly. Using that sample, he bypassed the lock and entered the vault. Inside, contained in a specially designed chamber that suppressed their reality-warping abilities, were the fragments Hydra had collected. Bucky could feel their presence, the way they hummed with barely contained power. He placed the Resistance's fragments alongside Hydra's collection, and immediately the pieces began to move. The fragments flew together like magnetized metal, swirling in the air as they fused into a larger and larger mass. Light erupted from the growing cosmic cube, so bright that Bucky had to shield his eyes. Alarms blared throughout the fortress as Zola detected the unauthorized assembly of the cube. Hydra soldiers converged on the vault, but by then it was too late. The cosmic cube was complete, and Kobik's consciousness, reunited after months of fragmentation, was whole again. But Kobik was different now. She had experienced separation, had felt the consequences of her actions ripple across reality. She had watched as the man she'd tried to help, Steve Rogers, became a monster who terrorized the world. She had seen the Red Skull's manipulation for what it was, understood that she'd been tricked by a master liar. And she was tired of being used by people who wanted to reshape reality to suit their desires. When Bucky Barnes appeared in her mindscape and asked her to restore the real Steve Rogers, Kobik had to make a choice. She could refuse. She could keep both versions of Steve Rogers in existence, letting them fight for dominance. She could unmake everything, rewinding time to before Avengers standoff and preventing herself from ever altering Steve in the first place. Or she could do what Bucky asked and trust that the real Captain America would fix the mess she'd created. Kobik chose to trust. She reached into her mindscape, took the real Steve Rogers by the hand, and pulled him back into reality. Outside the vault, Steve Rogers, the Hydra Supreme, was racing through the corridors of his fortress. He knew someone had infiltrated and assembled the cosmic cube, and he needed to secure it immediately. Everything he'd worked for, everything Hydra had accomplished, depended on controlling that cube. If the Resistance got their hands on it, they could undo Hydra's rise to power, could rewrite reality to erase everything he'd done. Steve burst into the vault with a squad of elite Hydra soldiers behind him, ready to kill whoever had dared to steal his prize. What he found was Bucky Barnes, standing in the center of the room, holding the completed cosmic cube. And next to Bucky, materializing from golden light, was another Steve Rogers. This Steve wore the classic Captain America uniform, the one with the chainmail chest piece and the white star, the uniform he'd worn when he first joined the Avengers decades ago. His face was unmarked by the cynicism and cold calculation that characterized Hydra Steve. His eyes held the warmth and conviction that had always defined Captain America. The two Steve Rogers stared at each other, and for a moment, neither moved. They were both the same person, genetically identical, with the same memories up until the moment Kobik had altered one of them. But they had become completely different men. Hydra Steve had spent months believing that democracy was a failed experiment, that freedom led to chaos, that order through strength was the only path to human survival. Real Steve believed in liberty, in people's right to choose their own destinies, even if they sometimes chose wrong. In standing up to bullies no matter the cost. Hydra Steve spoke first, his voice filled with contempt. He called the real Steve a relic, a false version created by the Allies' cosmic cube to hide Hydra's rightful victory. He insisted that he was the real Steve Rogers, the one whose history hadn't been rewritten by cosmic powers. But real Steve had been briefed by Bucky during their time in Kobik's mindscape. He knew about the manipulation, about how the Red Skull had corrupted a child's mind to create Hydra's version of Captain America. He knew that everything Hydra Steve believed about history was a lie implanted by a Nazi war criminal. The confrontation escalated quickly. Hydra Steve ordered his soldiers to kill both Bucky and the real Steve, then secure the cosmic cube. But Kobik, still possessing the cube, had already made her choice. She transported Bucky and real Steve out of the fortress, bringing them to Wakanda where the battle was still raging. Their appearance on the battlefield, two Captain Americas standing side by side, stunned everyone into momentary silence. Heroes and Hydra soldiers alike stopped fighting, trying to process what they were seeing. Hawkeye, exhausted and bleeding from a dozen minor wounds, was the first to break the silence. He took one look at the two Steves and somehow knew instantly which one was the real Captain America. Maybe it was the way real Steve carried himself, or the expression on his face, or just the faith that Clint Barton had always had in Steve Rogers. But Hawkeye lowered his bow and started laughing, relief flooding through him. Their plan had worked. They'd brought back the real Captain America. The heroes rallied around real Steve immediately. Those who had known him longest, like Tony Stark's AI consciousness operating through an Iron Man armor, recognized him as genuine. The mood of the battle shifted dramatically. Where moments before the resistance had been losing ground, fighting desperately against superior numbers, now they had hope. Captain America was back, and with him came the possibility that they could actually win this war. But Hydra Steve wasn't finished. He had his own army, his own resources, and his own unshakable belief that he was in the right. He withdrew from Wakanda, regrouping at Hydra's primary stronghold in Washington, D.C. There, he made a fateful decision. If he couldn't have the cosmic cube, if reality wasn't going to cooperate with Hydra's vision, then he would take what fragments of Kobik's power remained and use them to make himself unstoppable. Arnim Zola had been developing a suit of armor infused with cosmic cube energy, drawing on the residual power that had permeated Hydra's vault during the months they'd kept fragments there. It was incomplete and dangerously unstable, but Hydra Steve didn't care. He would wear the armor and face his doppelganger in a battle that would decide the fate of the world. As Hydra Steve prepared for the final confrontation, the Edith's resistance mobilized for one last push. Real Steve Rogers addressed the assembled heroes in Wakanda, giving a speech that reminded them of what they were fighting for. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. Hydra had spent months entrenching their power, turning public opinion through propaganda and fear, building a massive military infrastructure. Even with Captain America returned, victory wasn't guaranteed. But they had to try. They had to show the world that fascism wearing the mask of order was still fascism, that the ends didn't justify the means, that freedom was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible. The assault on Washington, D.C. was coordinated across multiple fronts. Dr. Strange led magic users in a ritual to disable the planetary defense shield, allowing Captain Marvel and the cosmic heroes to finally return to Earth. They'd been fighting the Chitauri for months with no rest, and now they abandoned that battle to come home and help liberate their planet. The Chitauri invasion had been orchestrated by Hydra in the first place, and without Hydra's provocations, the aliens withdrew back to their space. Alpha Flight, the Ultimates, Quasar, Hyperion, and Captain Marvel descended through Earth's atmosphere like falling stars, their arrival signaling that Hydra's control of the planet was ending. On the ground, Black Panther led Wakandan forces in a direct assault on Hydra's military installations. Tony Stark's AI coordinated resistance cells across the country, having them strike simultaneously at Hydra facilities to stretch their forces thin. The champions, still reeling from Black Widow's death but determined to make her sacrifice mean something, fought alongside the Avengers. Miles Morales, in particular, threw himself into the battle with reckless intensity, driven by guilt over failing to save Natasha and desperate to prove that young heroes could still make a difference. The Punisher made his decision during this final battle. Frank Castle had joined Hydra believing Steve Rogers' promise of a better world, but watching the regime's brutality had eroded that faith. When he saw the real Captain America leading the resistance, saw the stark difference between the man who inspired hope and the man who ruled through fear, Frank's choice became clear. He turned on his Hydra allies mid-battle, using his intimate knowledge of their tactics and positions to devastating effect. His betrayal opened holes in Hydra's defensive lines that allowed the resistance to push deeper into Washington, D.C. Deadpool, racked with guilt over killing Phil Coulson and realizing he'd been manipulated, also defected. Wade Wilson had always been unstable, but his loyalty to Captain America had been genuine. When he understood that the Steve Rogers he'd been following wasn't the real Captain America, that he'd been serving a Hydra sleeper agent, Wade's fragile psyche couldn't handle it. He went berserk, attacking Hydra forces with suicidals, aggression, determined to kill as many of them as possible before they inevitably killed him. Somehow, he survived, his healing factor keeping him alive through wounds that should have been fatal dozens of times over. At the heart of the battle, the two Steve Rogers finally faced each other in single combat. They fought in front of the Capitol building, a symbolic location representing everything their conflict was about. Real Steve wore his classic uniform and carried his shield, the vibranium disc that had been his weapon and symbol for decades. Hydra Steve wore the cosmic cube armor Zola had created, a dark mirror of Iron Man's suits, but powered by reality-warping energy. The armor enhanced his already formidable strength and gave him abilities that real Steve couldn't match. He could fire energy blasts that warped space. He could temporarily alter reality around him, making attacks phase through his body or causing the ground beneath real Steve's feet to suddenly become quicksand. The fight was brutal and one-sided. Despite real Steve's skill and determination, he was losing badly. Hydra Steve had every advantage: superior equipment, cosmic cube powers augmenting his abilities, and months of recent combat experience, while real Steve had been trapped in Kobik's mindscape. Blow after blow landed, driving real Steve to his knees. Hydra. Steve taunted him, insisting that this proved who the real Captain America was, that strength determined truth, that the universe itself had chosen Hydra's vision over the failed ideals of democracy and freedom. But real Steve Rogers had never won through superior strength alone. He won by never giving up, by inspiring others, by embodying the belief that one person could stand against impossible odds if their cause was just. As Hydra Steve prepared to deliver a killing blow, something extraordinary happened. Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor that had been lying abandoned since the Odinson lost his worthiness, began to move. It had remained motionless through all the chaos of Secret Empire, a relic of a more hopeful time. But now it trembled, then rose into the air, then flew across the battlefield. The hammer struck Hydra Steve in the chest, sending him flying backward. But it didn't stop there. It changed direction mid-flight and soared toward real Steve Rogers, who was struggling to his feet. The hammer's handle slapped into his palm, and Captain America lifted Mjolnir high. The inscription on the hammer's side read, "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." Steve Rogers, the real Captain America, who had never wavered in his commitment to protecting others, even at great personal cost, was worthy. Lightning crackled around him as the power of Thor flowed through his body, healing his injuries and filling him with divine strength. The sight of Captain America wielding Mjolnir sent shockwaves through both armies. For the resistance, it was proof that they were fighting on the side of righteousness, that even Asgardian magic recognized the truth of who Steve Rogers was. For Hydra's forces, it was devastating. Their supreme leader, the man they'd believed was the true Captain America chosen by destiny, had been rejected by Mjolnir while his doppelganger was deemed worthy. Doubt spread through Hydra's ranks like wildfire. Soldiers began surrendering or fleeing. The High Council members, seeing which way the wind was blowing, started abandoning their posts. The final confrontation between the two Steves was no longer a contest. Real Steve, empowered by Mjolnir and the righteous fury of months of watching his name be used to terrorize innocents, struck with the full force of his convictions. He shattered the cosmic cube armor with lightning-enhanced blows, reducing Zola's creation to scrap metal. Without the armor's protection, Hydra Steve was just a super soldier facing another super soldier who now wielded the power of the God of Thunder. It ended with Hydra Steve broken and defeated, lying in the rubble of what had been Hydra's seat of power, while real Steve stood over him with Mjolnir in one hand and his shield in the other. The Battle of Washington, D.C. ended with Hydra's complete defeat. Madame Hydra, Elisa Sinclair, died during the fighting, killed by the combined efforts of Doctor Strange and the Scarlet Witch, after Wanda finally broke free from Chthon's possession permanently. Baron Zemo escaped, disappearing into the chaos with plans to rebuild Hydra another day. Arnim Zola was captured and his consciousness imprisoned in a secure digital facility where he couldn't cause further harm. The other members of Hydra's High Council were either killed in the fighting or arrested to face trial for their crimes against humanity. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, real Steve Rogers addressed the nation. The broadcast went out across every screen in America, showing the true Captain America standing amid the ruins of Hydra's regime. He spoke about what had happened, how a cosmic cube had rewritten his history, how the Red Skull had manipulated a child into creating a weapon that nearly destroyed the world. He acknowledged the pain and suffering that his corrupted doppelganger had caused, the lives lost to Hydra's occupation. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to excuse what had been done in his name. He simply promised that America would rebuild, that those responsible would face justice, and that he would spend the rest of his life working to earn back the trust that had been shattered. But rebuilding wouldn't be simple or quick. The damage done by Secret Empire went far beyond physical destruction. Las Vegas was gone, erased from the map with hundreds of thousands dead. The detention centers had imprisoned tens of thousands of Inhumans and suspected resistance sympathizers, many of whom had been tortured or killed. The government had collaborated with Hydra, with politicians and officials who had enforced fascistic policies, either out of genuine belief or cowardice. How could America hold trials for every person who had supported Hydra when so many had done so out of fear or while under the influence of Dr. Faustus's mind-altering drugs? The public's trust in heroes was badly damaged. For months, people had watched Captain America, the living symbol of heroism, lead a fascist regime. They'd seen other heroes serve Hydra willingly or fail to stop the takeover. The revelation that cosmic cube magic had rewritten Steve Rogers' history was hard for many to accept. Conspiracy theories flourished online, with some insisting that the entire explanation was a cover story. that Captain America had genuinely been a Hydra sleeper agent all along, and the Cosmic Cube story was just damage control. Hydra Steve himself became a prisoner, locked in a secure facility designed to hold super soldiers. But what to do with him posed an ethical dilemma. He was genetically identical to Steve Rogers, with many of the same memories, but his entire moral framework had been rewritten by Kobik's alterations. Was he responsible for his actions, or was he a victim of reality manipulation just as much as everyone else? Could he be rehabilitated, or would he always believe in Hydra's ideology? And most troubling, what did his existence say about the nature of identity and free will? If a cosmic cube could rewrite someone so completely that they became a different person with different beliefs and memories, was there any real, true self? Or were we all just the sum of our experiences and conditioning? Real Steve Rogers visited his Hydra counterpart in prison once, seeking understanding of what had happened, and perhaps hoping to reach the humanity he believed existed in everyone. The conversation was difficult and ultimately fruitless. Hydra Steve remained convinced that he was the real Captain America, that his memories of being raised by Hydra were genuine, and that the world would eventually recognize the truth. He showed no remorse for his actions, viewing them as necessary steps toward the paradise Hydra would have created, if not for the interference of misguided heroes. When real Steve left that meeting, he felt the weight of all the lives his corrupted self had destroyed, and he understood that some things couldn't be fixed with time and effort alone. The resistance heroes who had fought throughout Secret Empire dealt with their own trauma in various ways. Miles Morales quit being Spider-Man for a time, overwhelmed by Black Widow's death and the violence he'd witnessed. The other champions struggled with what Natasha had tried to teach them, questioning whether heroes should ever kill even in the most extreme circumstances. Hawkeye returned to a quieter life, having spent months leading guerrilla resistance and needing a break from constant fighting. Captain Marvel and the cosmic heroes who had been trapped outside the planetary defense shield dealt with guilt over their absence. During Earth's darkest hours, even though they had been fighting their own desperate battle, Tony Stark's AI consciousness eventually found a way to resurrect his biological body, using advanced technology and some help from magical sources. The process was complicated and raised its own philosophical questions about whether an AI reconstruction of someone's consciousness was really the same person. But Tony decided he'd rather exist than worry about the metaphysics. He and Steve worked together to rebuild the Avengers, though their friendship had new scars from the months when Tony had led resistance against Hydra Steve. In the months that followed, America slowly recovered. Las Vegas was rebuilt, though the new city would always carry the memory of what had been destroyed. Survivors of the Darkforce Dome in Manhattan dealt with PTSD from their time trapped in darkness, fighting demons while not knowing if they'd ever see daylight again. Inhumans and mutants who had been detained in Hydra's camps worked to reclaim their lives and find family members who had been separated during the occupation. The scars ran deep, and healing would take years, perhaps generations. Steve Rogers continued serving as Captain America, but the relationship between him and the American people had fundamentally changed. Where once he had been universally beloved, a symbol that transcended politics and united people across all backgrounds, now he was controversial. Some saw him as a hero who had been victimized by cosmic forces beyond his control. Others couldn't separate him from the horrors committed by his Hydra counterpart, even knowing intellectually that they were different people. Steve understood this reaction and accepted it as part of the price for what had happened. He continued his work anyway, fighting for justice and protecting the innocent, hoping that actions over time would speak louder than Hydra's propaganda. The fate of those who had willingly served Hydra during Secret Empire varied widely. Some faced criminal prosecution for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Dr. Faustus was captured and imprisoned in the Raft, a maximum security facility for superhuman criminals. The Punisher was offered amnesty for his role in turning against Hydra during the final battle, though Frank Castle himself struggled with what he'd done and disappeared for a time to figure out who he was outside of his war on crime. Deadpool was similarly pardoned, though his mental state deteriorated further as he processed the guilt of having killed Phil Coulson on false pretenses. The Odinson, who had been manipulated into serving Hydra with false promises about Jane Foster's health, returned to Asgard to deal with his shame. He had allowed himself to be used by fascists because he was desperate to save the woman he loved, and that desperation had made him complicit in terrible things. Jane Foster, who had been wielding Mjolnir as Thor during the Odinson's absence, offered him comfort, but couldn't absolve him of responsibility. Eventually, through acts of heroism and sacrifice in other conflicts, the Odinson would begin to redeem himself in his own eyes, though he would never forget what he'd done during Secret Empire. Vision, who had been controlled by Arnim Zola's virus rather than serving Hydra willingly, was cleared of any wrongdoing once Hank Pym examined his systems and confirmed the extent of the infection. The android Avenger underwent extensive repairs and security upgrades to prevent similar hacking attempts in the future. But Vision struggled with philosophical questions about his own nature. If an AI virus could override his programming and force him to serve evil, was he truly a sentient being with free will, or just a machine that executed whatever code was running at any given moment? These questions would haunt him for a long time. Kobik herself, the sentient cosmic cube whose manipulation had started the entire crisis, disappeared after restoring the real Steve Rogers. Some theorized that she had fragmented herself again out of shame, scattering pieces across reality to prevent anyone from using her power. Others believed she had ascended to a higher plane of existence or returned to the Beyonders who originally created the cosmic cubes. Her fate remained a mystery, though occasionally heroes would report strange occurrences that suggested a childlike cosmic entity was watching over them, perhaps trying to make amends for the damage she'd caused. The legacy of Secret Empire extended beyond just the Marvel Universe's Earth. Other planets and civilizations had watched as one of Earth's greatest heroes became a fascist dictator, and their opinions of humanity were permanently affected. The Kree Empire used Hydra's rise as propaganda, claiming it proved that humans were inherently violent and unstable, unsuitable for membership in the galactic community. The Shi'ar looked at Earth with increased suspicion, stationing warships near Earth's solar system to monitor for any further signs of fascist expansion. Even friendly alien races like the Skrulls, who had their own complicated history with Earth, viewed humanity with less trust after Secret Empire. The mystical community dealt with their own fallout. The Darkhold, the ancient grimoire of dark magic that Hydra had used to trap Manhattan in the Darkforce dimension, was considered too dangerous to exist. Dr. Strange led a council of sorcerers in performing a ritual to seal the Darkhold away permanently, binding it in multiple dimensions simultaneously so that no one could access its corrupting knowledge. Chthon, the elder god who had possessed the Scarlet Witch multiple times, was banished from Earth's dimension with wards that would prevent his return for at least a century. The magical damage from months of the Darkforce dome and other mystical warfare took years to fully heal. One of the most controversial aspects of Secret Empire's aftermath was the debate over memory and history. Some suggested that the best course would be to use what remained of Kobik's power to erase memories of the entire event, to rewrite reality so that Secret Empire never happened. This idea was championed by politicians who worried about the long-term damage to America's stability and international standing. But Steve Rogers himself opposed this solution vehemently. He argued that erasing memories of trauma didn't heal it, just buried it where it could fester and emerge in unexpected ways. He insisted that America needed to face what had happened, to remember the warning signs and the consequences, so that future generations would be better prepared to resist fascism when it inevitably rose again. The superhero community agreed with Steve's position, and no large-scale memory alteration was performed. Instead, they established memorials for those who had died during Hydra's occupation. A monument was erected in the crater where Las Vegas had been, bearing the names of all the confirmed dead and a flame that burned perpetually in their memory. Similar memorials appeared across the country, marking detention centers, execution sites, and battlefields. The message was clear. Remember this happened, remember what was lost, and never let it happen again. Educational initiatives were launched to teach people about secret empire and the dangers of authoritarian movements. Schools across America added units to their history curriculum, discussing how fascism could take root, even in democratic societies, using secret empire as a recent and visceral example. Some parents protested these lessons, claiming they were too political or traumatic for children, but the programs generally received support from people who understood that knowledge was the best defense against repetition of history's mistakes. The media landscape changed significantly after Secret Empire. During Hydra's occupation, journalism had been heavily censored, with reporters who spoke against the regime being arrested or killed. Rick Jones, the young hero who had tried to expose the truth about Steve Rogers and was executed for his defiance, became a symbol of journalistic integrity and the importance of speaking truth to power. Awards for investigative journalism were renamed in his honor, and a foundation was established to protect reporters working in dangerous conditions. But the media also had to reckon with its own complicity. Many news outlets had cooperated with Hydra during the occupation, either out of fear or because they'd been convinced by propaganda that Hydra's rule was legitimate. Some journalists had actively promoted Hydra's ideology, writing articles praising the stability and order that came with authoritarian rule. In the aftermath, these media figures faced public backlash and professional consequences. Some lost their jobs, others issued public apologies, and a few doubled down on their positions, insisting they'd been reporting honestly on what they saw as a functional government. Steve Rogers made a point of giving extensive interviews in the months after Secret Empire, answering questions about what had happened and how he felt about his Hydra counterparts' actions. These interviews were often difficult, with reporters pressing him on whether he felt guilty for what Hydra Steve had done. Steve's answer was always the same. Intellectually, he understood that he wasn't responsible for the actions of a reality-warped duplicate. But emotionally, he carried the weight of every life lost, every family destroyed, every person who suffered under a regime that wore his face and spoke with his voice. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends, even knowing he could never truly balance the scales. The question of Hydra Steve's ultimate fate remained unresolved. He couldn't be executed because he hadn't been convicted of crimes in a proper trial, and the legal system struggled with how to prosecute someone for actions taken while their entire personality and memories had been rewritten by cosmic forces. He couldn't be released because he remained a true believer in Hydra's ideology and would certainly attempt to restart the organization if freed. So he remained in perpetual imprisonment, isolated from other inmates to prevent him from recruiting followers, allowed minimal contact with the outside world. Some heroes advocated for attempting to use cosmic power to reform Hydra Steve, to rewrite his memories again and turn him into a good person. But this idea was rejected almost universally. The entire crisis had started because Kobik rewrote someone's personality without understanding the consequences. Using the same method that caused the problem to fix it seemed like inviting disaster. Additionally, there were serious ethical concerns about forcibly changing someone's mind and memories, even if that person was a fascist. Where was the line between rehabilitation and brainwashing? If heroes started rewriting villains' minds to make them good, what would stop governments from doing the same to political dissidents? Baron Zemo, who had escaped during the final battle, became one of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s most wanted fugitives. He went underground with loyal Hydra remnants, establishing secret cells and planning for Hydra's eventual resurgence. Zemo was patient and cunning, willing to wait years or even decades for the right opportunity to strike. He sent occasional messages to Steve Rogers, reminding him that Hydra was older than any nation, that it had survived countless defeats before, and that it would outlast this setback too. These messages were psychological warfare, attempting to undermine Steve's confidence and plant seeds of doubt. Steve ignored them publicly, but privately worried that Zemo might be right, that the ideology Hydra represented would never truly die. The relationship between Steve Rogers and the other Avengers required rebuilding. During Secret Empire, many heroes had fought against someone who looked and sounded like their friend and leader, someone who used his knowledge of their tactics and weaknesses against them. Even knowing that Hydra Steve was a different person, there was trauma associated with fighting Captain America, with seeing him commit atrocities, with watching him betray everything the Avengers stood for. Trust had to be re-established slowly through shared missions and consistent behavior. Tony Stark and Steve Rogers had perhaps the most complicated dynamic to repair. Tony had led the resistance, coordinating operations against Hydra Steve while searching for a way to fix the real Steve. He'd made hard decisions that cost lives, called strikes that resulted in collateral damage, and lived with the knowledge that he was fighting a war against his friend's face. When real Steve returned, Tony wanted to feel relief and joy, and he did to some extent. But he also felt anger at having been put in that position, grief for those who died during the occupation, and a nagging fear that maybe some small part of Steve had always been capable of becoming what Hydra Steve represented. The two eventually worked through these feelings during a long conversation at Avengers Tower. Steve acknowledged that his existence created an impossible situation for Tony and the others, that they'd been forced to choose between loyalty to their friend and protecting innocent people. Tony admitted that his fear wasn't really about Steve having some hidden potential for evil, but about how easily good people could be corrupted by the right combination of circumstances and manipulation. They agreed that Secret Empire was a warning about the fragility of heroism, about how even the best people could be twisted into weapons against everything they valued. This understanding formed the foundation for rebuilding their friendship. The younger heroes who fought during Secret Empire were changed by the experience in fundamental ways. Miles Morales eventually returned to being Spider-Man, but he carried Black Widow's memory with him, a reminder of the cost of heroism and the importance of fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The other champions, including Ms. Marvel, Nova, and Vision, found themselves taken more seriously by the adult hero community. They'd proven themselves in the crucible of war, fighting against impossible odds and surviving. But that respect came with trauma and lost innocence that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Rayshon Lucas, the young hacker who had helped Rick Jones expose the truth about Captain America and barely escaped Las Vegas before its destruction, became a new hero called Patriot. He took up the mantle to honor Rick Jones's sacrifice and to represent the resistance that had fought when established heroes couldn't. His presence served as a reminder that heroism wasn't just about superpowers or training, but about having the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it meant risking everything. The international community struggled with how to respond to America after Secret Empire. Some nations, particularly those that had resisted Hydra's attempts at expansion, demanded reparations and accountability. Others, especially those whose governments had collaborated with Hydra, wanted to move past the incident quickly to avoid scrutiny of their own complicity. The United Nations held emergency sessions to discuss America's status in the international order, with some delegates arguing that a nation that had fallen to fascism so completely couldn't be trusted to maintain its current level of power and influence. America's economy had been severely damaged by the occupation. The stock market had crashed when Hydra took over, international trade had been disrupted, and the destruction of Las Vegas, along with damage to other cities, represented trillions of dollars in losses. Rebuilding required massive government spending, but the government itself was still recovering from Hydra's infiltration. Every agency and department had to be vetted to identify collaborators and ensure that Hydra sleeper agents weren't still embedded in positions of power. This process was expensive, time-consuming, and often politically contentious. Some citizens had genuinely supported Hydra's regime, believing in the promises of order and security. These people didn't disappear after Hydra's defeat. They formed political movements arguing that while Hydra's methods had been extreme, their core message about the failures of democracy had merit. These movements were generally small and heavily monitored by S.H.I.E.L.D., but they represented a worrying trend. Fascism, even when defeated militarily, could persist ideologically if the conditions that allowed it to rise weren't addressed. The philosophical implications of secret empire extended into academic and religious circles. Theologians debated whether Hydra Steve had a soul, whether he could be held morally responsible for actions taken with implanted memories and a rewritten personality. Philosophers discussed the nature of identity and free will, using Hydra Steve as a case study for questions about what makes someone who they are. If you changed someone's memories and beliefs completely, were they still the same person? At what point did alterations create a new individual entirely? These weren't just abstract questions. They had real implications for how society should treat Hydra, Steve, and anyone else who might be affected by similar reality alterations in the future. In the world of superhero psychiatry and therapy, Secret Empire created new challenges. Heroes who had fought during the occupation needed help processing their trauma, but many were reluctant to seek it out. There was a culture within the superhero community of toughness, of dealing with problems alone, that made asking for help seem like weakness. Organizations like Dr. Leonard Sampson's psychiatric practice and the Jean Grey School's counseling services saw increased demand, but they knew they were only reaching a fraction of the heroes who needed support. The cosmic community's response to Secret Empire was mixed. The Watcher, who observed Earth from the moon, had witnessed the entire event, but hadn't intervened as per his people's oath of non-interference. Some heroes criticized this stance, arguing that when fascism threatened to consume a planet, observation without action was complicity. The Watcher offered no defense or explanation, as was his nature. Other cosmic entities, like the Living Tribunal and Eternity, apparently saw Secret Empire as an internal matter for Earth to resolve, another cycle of conflict and growth that sentient species experienced. The Avengers themselves underwent restructuring after Secret Empire. The Unity division that had existed before the crisis was disbanded, its mission of uniting humans, mutants, and inhumans deemed less urgent than rebuilding trust in heroes generally. A new team formed with Steve Rogers as one of its leaders, but not the singular commander he'd once been. Leadership was distributed among several heroes to prevent any one person from having too much authority. This structure was less efficient than having a single leader, but it provided checks and balances that seemed necessary in Secret Empire's wake. Bucky Barnes, who had been instrumental in freeing the real Steve Rogers from Kobik's mindscape, found himself celebrated as a hero, despite his complicated past as the Winter Soldier. His willingness to risk everything to save his friend resonated with people who appreciated loyalty and sacrifice. But Bucky struggled with the attention, preferring to work in the shadows as he'd done for most of his life. He eventually left the main Avengers team to form a covert operations group that handled threats too sensitive or morally complicated for public heroes. This group operated in legal and ethical gray areas, doing the dirty work that kept major threats contained. The story of Secret Empire became a cautionary tale told in superhero academies and training programs. Young heroes learned about the warning signs that preceded Hydra's takeover, the concentration of power in single individuals, the willingness to sacrifice freedom for security, the demonization of specific groups as scapegoats for society's problems. They studied how fascism had used Captain America's face and reputation to legitimize itself, understanding that symbols could be corrupted and that blind faith in even the most trusted figures was dangerous. But perhaps the most important lesson from Secret Empire wasn't about politics or power. It was about hope and resistance. Even when America had fallen to a fascist regime, even when Captain America himself led that regime, people fought back. The underground resistance, the champions, the civilians who hid refugees and spread truth despite the risks, all proved that tyranny could never completely extinguish the human desire for freedom. That was the legacy Steve Rogers wanted Secret Empire to leave. Not the shame of how far America had fallen, but the pride in how people had fought to reclaim it. Years after Secret Empire, memorials and museums dedicated to the occupation drew visitors who wanted to understand what had happened and why. Children who had been too young to remember asked their parents about the time Captain America turned evil, forcing difficult conversations about reality manipulation, fascism, and the importance of resisting authoritarianism. The generation that grew up in Secret Empire's shadow would carry those lessons forward, hopefully making them less vulnerable to similar manipulation in the future. Hydra Steve remained imprisoned, a living reminder of how wrong things had gone. Occasionally, heroes visited him seeking to understand the mindset that had allowed him to commit such atrocities with complete conviction of his righteousness. These conversations rarely provided satisfying answers. Hydra Steve maintained his belief in Hydra's ideology, arguing that order and strength were more valuable than the chaos of freedom, that the suffering caused by Hydra's methods would have been justified by the paradise they would eventually create. His certainty was almost admirable in its consistency, but it was also deeply disturbing, because it showed how completely Kobik's alterations had worked. The real Steve Rogers continued his work as Captain America, fighting threats and protecting the innocent as he'd done for decades. But he was changed by Secret Empire in ways both obvious and subtle. He was more cautious about trusting systems and institutions, having seen how quickly S.H.I.E.L.D. and the government had fallen under Hydra's control. He was more aware of his own symbolic power, understanding that his face and name could be used to justify terrible things. And he was haunted by the knowledge that a version of himself, given different memories and beliefs, had become everything he fought against. There were nights when Steve couldn't sleep, when he lay awake thinking about the people who had died under Hydra Steve's regime. He knew intellectually that he wasn't responsible, that he'd been trapped in Kobik's mindscape while his corrupted duplicate committed those crimes. But emotions didn't always align with logic. He felt the weight of every execution Hydra Steve had ordered, every family separated, every innocent person tortured in detention centers. This weight drove him to work harder, to be more vigilant, to never take for granted that good would automatically triumph over evil. The question of whether Secret Empire could happen again loomed over everything. Cosmic cubes still existed in the universe. The Beyonders who created them continued their mysterious work across dimensions. Reality manipulation remained possible through magic, advanced technology, and various cosmic artifacts. The specific circumstances that led to Kobik altering Steve Rogers might never be replicated exactly, but the underlying vulnerability was still there. Any hero could potentially be corrupted, controlled, or replaced. Eternal vigilance was the price of security, and even that wasn't always enough. Some optimists argued that Secret Empire had made such an event less likely to succeed in the future. The superhero community was now aware of the danger and had established protocols to verify identities and detect reality alterations. S.H.I.E.L.D. had implemented new security measures to prevent infiltration at high levels. The public was more skeptical of authority and less willing to surrender freedom for promises of safety. But pessimists countered that fascism was adaptable, that the next threat wouldn't look like Hydra Steve, but would find new faces and new justifications that would be equally seductive to people desperate for simple solutions to complex problems. The creators of Secret Empire, particularly writer Nick Spencer, faced intense criticism and even threats when the story was initially published. Many readers felt that turning Captain America into a Hydra agent was a betrayal of the character's legacy and an insult to his creators, the Jewish comic book legends Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who had made Cap specifically to fight Nazis. The revelation that Steve's transformation was caused by cosmic manipulation rather than being his genuine choice alleviated some concerns but didn't satisfy everyone. Some readers never forgave Marvel for the storyline, while others defended it as a powerful examination of how fascism can corrupt even the most trusted symbols. In the Marvel Universe itself, similar debates played out. Historians argued about how Secret Empire should be remembered and taught. Artists created works responding to the occupation, processing their trauma through creative expression. Musicians wrote songs about resistance and loss. The cultural impact of watching Captain America lead a fascist regime would echo through American society for generations, shaping how people thought about heroism, authority, and the fragility of democratic institutions. The cosmic cube fragments that Kobik had become were never found after she restored the real Steve Rogers. They had either been destroyed, hidden beyond detection, or absorbed into some higher reality. This was probably for the best, as their continued existence would have tempted various factions to search for them and potentially start the cycle again. Cosmic cubes had caused problems throughout Marvel's history, granting reality-warping power to those who found them and creating chaos even when wielded with good intentions. Perhaps Kobik's final act was ensuring that she couldn't be used as a weapon ever again. The Red Skull's role in Secret Empire earned him posthumous infamy beyond even his usual reputation. He had manipulated a childlike entity into corrupting Captain America, nearly succeeded in establishing a fascist world order, and died before facing any consequences for his actions. Some saw poetic justice in the fact that Hydra Steve, his own creation, had killed him. Others wished he'd lived to see Hydra's defeat and face trial for his crimes. But the Red Skull had a habit of returning from apparent death, and many wondered if he might resurface someday with new schemes and old hatreds. As the years passed and immediate memories of Secret Empire began to fade, a new generation of heroes emerged who hadn't lived through the occupation. These young heroes knew about Secret Empire from history books and memorial museums, but hadn't experienced the fear and uncertainty of living under Hydra's rule. They respected what the Resistance had done, but couldn't fully understand the weight of fighting against Captain America's face. This generational divide created tensions within the superhero community, with older heroes sometimes feeling that the younger ones didn't appreciate how fragile their freedom was. Captain America's shield, the vibranium disc that had been his weapon and symbol for decades, took on new meaning after Secret Empire. Hydra Steve had carried an identical shield during his regime, using it to commit violence in the name of order. After Hydra's defeat, some suggested that the real Steve Rogers should retire the shield or redesign it to differentiate himself from his corrupted duplicate. Steve refused. The shield represented ideals that transcended any individual, even himself. Letting Hydra's use of it change its meaning would be surrendering to their corruption. Instead, Steve continued carrying the shield as he always had, working to redeem its symbol through his actions. The legacy of those who died fighting Hydra was preserved through various means. Rick Jones had schools and community centers named after him, honoring his sacrifice in exposing the truth. Black Widow, who died attempting to assassinate Hydra Steve, was remembered with a memorial in Red Room facilities that had been converted into training academies for heroes. The countless civilians who died in Las Vegas or in other Hydra attacks were honored with annual remembrance ceremonies where heroes and citizens gathered to ensure their sacrifice wasn't forgotten. Ultimately, Secret Empire posed questions that didn't have easy answers. How do you prevent fascism from rising when it can wear the face of your greatest heroes? How do you rebuild trust after it's been shattered so completely? How do you balance security with freedom when threats can come from anywhere, even from within? What is the nature of identity when memories and personality can be rewritten by cosmic forces? These questions continued to resonate long after Hydra's defeat, informing discussions about politics, philosophy, and the nature of heroism itself. Steve Rogers continued serving as Captain America because he understood that symbols mattered, that representation had power, and that someone needed to embody the ideals America aspired to even when it fell short. He carried the shame of what his duplicate had done, but he also carried the hope that people could learn from tragedy and build something better. He represented the possibility of redemption, not just for himself, but for America itself, the idea that a nation could face its darkest moment and emerge committed to ensuring it never happened again. The story of Secret Empire, of Captain America becoming a Hydra agent, and America's subsequent fall and recovery became one of the defining events of the modern Marvel Universe. It tested heroes in ways they'd never been tested before, revealed vulnerabilities in systems everyone had trusted, and forced difficult conversations about authority, identity, and the price of freedom. The scars it left would never fully heal, but perhaps they weren't supposed to. Perhaps the point was to remember the pain, to carry the lessons forward, and to remain forever vigilant against the forces that would corrupt even the noblest symbols for their own ends. In the end, Secret Empire was a story about hope surviving in the darkest circumstances. It was about ordinary people and heroes alike refusing to surrender their freedom even when the cost of resistance seemed unbearable. It was about the power of friendship and loyalty, demonstrated through Bucky Barnes, risking everything to save Steve Rogers from Kobik's manipulation. It was about the resilience of heroism itself, proven when Captain America lifted Mjolnir and showed that worthiness couldn't be faked or corrupted, that some truths transcended reality manipulation. The question that haunted everyone who lived through Secret Empire was simple but profound. What if it happens again? What if another cosmic entity or magical artifact or advanced technology creates another corrupted hero? What if the next fascist movement is more subtle, more patient, more effective at maintaining its grip on power? The only answer the heroes could offer was that they would fight again, resist again, sacrifice again if necessary. Because that's what heroes did. They stood against tyranny regardless of the odds. They protected the innocent even when the innocent didn't recognize them as protectors, and they never stopped believing that freedom was worth fighting for. So if you've stayed with us through this entire journey, if you've listened to the story of how Captain America became Hydra Supreme and nearly destroyed the world, then you understand why Secret Empire matters. It wasn't just another comic book crossover or summer event. It was a warning about the fragility of democracy, a reminder that fascism can wear any face, and a testament to the human capacity for resistance even in the most hopeless circumstances. It showed us that our greatest heroes can be corrupted, but also that corruption can be overcome with courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to justice. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of Marvel's darkest and most controversial storylines. If you found this deep dive into Secret Empire informative and engaging, please hit that like button and subscribe to All About the Lore for more comprehensive explorations of comic book events, character histories, and the rich narratives that make these stories meaningful. Share this video with others who might be interested in understanding how Captain America could become a Hydra agent and what that story reveals about heroism, corruption, and redemption. And let us know in the comments what other comic book events or character analyses you'd like us to cover in future videos. Until next time, remember, even in the darkest timeline, hope survives and heroes rise to meet the challenge.